Before we start this episode, I'd like to tell you all something. Thank you for all the support that you've shown me over the past few months. I love making these videos. However, I am starting a new job soon and I'll be moving to a new city. So my apartment and Wi-Fi situation are still up in the air. What I'm getting around to is that the rate of videos may go down for a bit as I get settled in, but the channel isn't going anywhere. I hope you enjoy today's video. This is the story of American Airlines Flight 331. On the 22nd of December 2009, an American Airlines 737 is flying from Miami International Airport as it heads on its way to Norman Manley International Airport in Kingston, Jamaica. The 737 today has 148 passengers and 6 crew members on board. The passengers include 3 infants. On this leg of the flight, the pilot flying would be the captain and the co-pilot would be the pilot monitoring. The plane climbed out of Miami normally. After departure, they were to climb to 35,000 feet and then climb to 37,000 feet as they headed towards Jamaica. The flight was bumpy. Turbulence buffeted the plane as it headed towards Jamaica. It was so bad that the pilot had to stop drink service on multiple occasions during the flight. As they neared Jamaica, they got an ACARS message. Their primary diversion airport had closed. They now talked about how they'd handle an emergency. As they flew in, they got the weather reports from the ground. The runway was wet, but to quote the crew, it was just another day at the office. The crew decided to do a straight-in approach onto runway 12 rather than a circling approach onto runway 30 with a low ceiling. They felt that a straight-in approach onto runway 12 was their best bet for a successful landing, even though runway 12 had a significant tailwind. The runway at Kingston, Jamaica was over 9,000 feet long, so even with a tailwind on such a long runway, a landing was safe. The captain asks everyone to be seated for landing. He fully expects the approach to be bumpy. At 9:51 p.m. EST, the controller asks Flight 331 to descend to flight level 150. Soon after being transferred from en route to approach control, the pilots asked the controller if other planes had an issue with the weather when coming in to land. The controller replies with, "Didn't have any problems coming in." As they approached the airport, the flight crew talked about using the speed brakes or descending to a lower altitude to burn off more fuel so that they'd be under the maximum weight for landing at Kingston, Jamaica. At 10:04 p.m. EST, the controller says, "Be advised, the information given to you by the en route controller is still the same. Visibility 5 miles, and there is moderate rain at the station. Wind 320 at 10 knots. There's no record of the en route controller giving the crew any of this information." But the crew pushes on. At 10:14 p.m. EST, the controller asks them to maintain 4,000 feet. Once they reach the waypoint Kenya, they can then start their straight-in approach onto runway 12. The wind is worse now, at 15 knots, but it was well within the limits of the 737 that they were flying. The crew of Flight 331 tell the controller that they were starting their straight-in approach. The crew had an eye on the displays to see if there were any low-level wind shears, but no such warning came. At 10:17 p.m., the approach controller passes the plane to the tower controller at Manley, Kingston, Jamaica. The tower checks with the pilots about their intentions to use runway 12. They were now 4 nautical miles away from the runway. The rain picked up and there was some light to moderate turbulence on the approach, but all was good for a landing. The visibility was more than they needed. The tailwind was well below the limits for a landing. At 500 feet, the first officer calls out, "On speed, sink 800. At 550 feet, the captain disconnects the autopilots and flies the plane manually, but he leaves the auto throttles engaged. The ILS that guides the plane to runway 12 was offset by about 3 degrees to the north of the runway. So the pilots using the ILS had to make a very slight left turn at the last moment and also transition from instruments to visual cues to land the plane. As the plane approached the runway, the plane was a bit high. Both the PAPI and the ILS systems confirmed this. The pilot has an HUD or a heads-up display that shows him information about the approach. But in this case, he decided to not use it as it gave him too much information. The pilot could see the real runway, a fake runway that the HUD plotted to make landing easier, but due to the ILS offset, I assumed the fake runway just got in the way, and so the pilot did not want to use it. So the pilot stays in A1 mode, letting the localizer take him in all the way, and then making a slight left turn to line up with the runway. The plane crosses the runway threshold at a height of 70 feet. The FDR shows that the captain made small nose-up commands at 70 feet and manually disconnected the auto throttles at 35 feet and closed the throttles. The plane is at 148 knots at this time. At this point, the plane is slightly pitching up, which reduced its descent rate. The airplane continued to float along the runway. It passed the PAPI lights at 38 feet. Something's wrong. By this time, the plane should be on the ground during a normal landing. The plane floats for 10 more seconds, finally touching down 4,100 feet from the threshold, or 1,130 feet beyond the touchdown zone. The wheels hit the ground and the spoilers deploy, but the plane bounces and touches down again 200 feet down the runway. The co-pilot engages the reversers. The captain sees that the plane isn't slowing down like he had hoped. He overrides the braking system and puts on full manual brakes and puts the reversers into max. They soon realized one thing. The plane didn't have enough room to stop. The plane overran the runway at 62 knots. The plane broke through a fence, crossed a road, and came to rest on a sandy, rocky beach, splitting up into 3 parts. The wing tanks ruptured, soaking the beach in fuel. Thankfully, there was no post-crash fire, and all on board survived. The marks on the runway and the data from the FDR make it plenty clear that the plane touched down way too late during the landing sequence. The first thing that might have played a part in this is the runway lighting. On the night of the landing, the airport was having electrical troubles, which meant that the outer perimeter lights might have been out. This might have given the pilots a feeling that they were higher up than they actually were, an illusion, if you will. The airport was extensively studied post the crash, and the friction values came in acceptable for the runway. The runway had enough friction to let the plane stop. But what does concern investigators is the standing water on the runway. American Airlines was supposed to tell the crews about pools of water on the runways, but neither the crew nor the dispatcher were aware of this. The runways at Kingston were not equipped with grooves on the runway. The grooves are used to channel water away from the runway and thus prevent pools of water forming on the runway. This could have played a part in the plane not stopping as soon as they had hoped. The actions of the crew before the landing also came under scrutiny. The crew was aware of the weather, the icing conditions, and the landing weight of the airplane. In fact, the crew had a bit of foresight in bringing the weight of the plane down prior to landing so that they would not be overweight when they did reach Kingston. But even when the controller gives them a report of the increased wind activity, especially a tailwind, there isn't much discussion of it in the cockpit, a sign that CRM, or cockpit resource management, isn't as good as it should be. Now, the investigators look at the actions of the pilot at the very end of their approach. When the captain made a slight nose-up input, the co-pilot said nothing. Maybe the co-pilot could have called for a go-around, but he said nothing. Maybe their environment fooled them into thinking that everything was okay. It was dark outside and the visibility was at 2,200 meters at the time of the accident. Moreover, the runway at Kingston did not have touchdown zone lighting, center line lighting, and reflective paint on the runway at the time of the accident. This made the runway look darker than usual and could have made it hard for the pilots to judge depth, which would explain why the plane floated for so long. In addition to this, the rain made it hard to see. Due to the power outage, there were no lights beyond the runway, making it hard to establish a horizon. The possibility that the captain experienced a visual illusion that the aircraft was lower than it actually was because of its higher ground speed caused by the tailwind resulted in the runway lights going by faster may have caused the captain to prematurely make the pitch-up inputs to flare for landing. In the end, these events came together to cause the crash of Flight 331, the bad weather, the lack of lighting, and the less braking at the start of the incident. All of these factors played a small part in the disaster. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. A big thank you to Curious Plane Spotter for letting me use his amazing videos on my video. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you.